Hello, today we're going to talk about the Great Depression. The photograph that you see here is a shanty town. It is kind of an area on the outskirts of a city that was hastily thrown together by people who had no place else to live, and you can see that there are shacks that are basically thrown together. Sometimes people might even be living in their cars, and this is because they've lost their jobs, they've lost their life savings, and often they've lost their homes and they have nowhere else to go. And of course these shanty towns would often be called Hoovervilles because Herbert Hoover was president when the Depression hit, and he got a great deal of blame for it, or for at least not doing enough to help people during the course of the Depression. So Herbert Hoover, of course, again, is president when the Depression begins. He is one of the Republican presidents of the Republican decade, the 1920s. And he really did not believe that government should play an active role in the economy, and so that really explains a lot about the way he approached the Great Depression. He believed in this idea of rugged individualism. You know, when someone who is rugged is tough, they're determined. Individualism means you are doing this on your own, and so, you know, he felt that people should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak, and get themselves out of, you know, the situation that they were in. It became clear fairly quickly that that was much easier said than done, yet that was kind of always Hoover's mindset approaching the Depression. He kind of believed the economy would recover on its own, and he didn't necessarily believe that a lot of government intervention needed to take place to allow that to happen. He did create some programs, so he didn't completely turn a blind eye to what had been going on, but he tended to, instead of helping individuals and the common people, he helped businesses, because he felt that if businesses were aided, that they would recover, and that prosperity would trickle down to workers, because businesses would be able to hire more workers or perhaps increase wages, and that would help in the end everybody. Another approach was taken by Democrats in Congress. They passed the Held-Hulsing tariff, and that was obviously to protect U.S. industry. We've talked again and again about tariffs and how they are protective of American industry and manufacturing. But the problem is other countries pass high tariffs as well. Foreign markets are going to stop purchasing American goods. There will be what are called retaliatory tariffs and retaliation. The other countries are doing just as badly, if not worse, than the United States, because many of them, particularly in Europe, just never had a chance to recover from World War I. So this really is a worldwide depression that affects all aspects of the economy throughout the world, not just in the United States. But the tariff, although it's protecting American industry, it's also causing many problems too. Another situation that Hoover had to contend with relatively early in the Depression was what's called the bonus army. So the bonus army consisted of World War I veterans who had been promised pensions by Congress in 1924, and Congress stated that these pensions would be paid much, much later in 1945. That would have been all well and good, perhaps, but because of the hardships of the times, these veterans wanted to have their payments made early. They were promised $1.25 for every day that they served overseas, or $1 for every day that they served stateside, and so this could really be a big boost for them in a period when many of them found themselves unemployed. So they were hoping that the government would give them their pensions early. And the government pretty much said, no, we can't do that. So 15,000 of these veterans marched on Washington, D.C. in 1932. About 10,000 of them ended up staying and setting up shanty towns, which of course again are Hoovervilles. And so Washington, D.C., the nation of our capital, had these shanty towns set up with 10,000 people living there. And it wasn't just veterans. It was their wives, it was their children, whole families were living there. And it became, a big embarrassment to the government. So after a year, they were forcibly removed by the Army, led by Douglas MacArthur and his second-in-command, Eisenhower, two names that, of course, you will see in the future when we talk about World War II, and, of course, Eisenhower will later become president. But, it was a very embarrassing situation. It was very sad that the government had to expel these people who had fought for their country, not too long before, in just a kind of sad incident in American history. So when the 1932 election comes around, Hoover is pretty unpopular, and the American people are pretty unhappy. About 1 out of 4 Americans are unemployed. That's a huge amount of people unemployed in the country. U.S. income was only about 50% of what it had been in 1929. And so, obviously the election is all about the Depression, basically. Republicans, they nominate Hoover again, and he just can't contend with FDR, who comes in with a lot of new ideas, a lot of new promises for the American people. So FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he wins by a landslide. He had previously been the governor of New York, which obviously was an important experience for him in leadership and as an executive. Now, FDR's first 100 days in office were a very, very productive period, probably one of the most productive periods for any president in history. Now, when he was first inaugurated, he made a very famous inaugural address, and in it he said this famous quote, "All we have to fear is fear itself." And so, in other words, he was saying we can't be afraid to kind of just be paralyzed by fear. We can't be like the deer in the headlights. We have to try something. And if what we try doesn't work, we'll keep trying. So he really ushered in this period of experimentation, trying different methods to try to ease the Depression, to try to help the nation recover. He also was able to convince Congress to support many of his programs, which we will be talking about soon. He also, to reassure the American public, held what were known as fireside chats in the White House. It was like he was sitting, next to a fire, and over the radio you would hear him addressing you, and it was just very comforting to people to hear their president speak to them this way. And he just continued to try to ease the minds of people that the government would continue to take steps to try to alleviate the problems of the Depression for people. So FDR says that he is going to provide a new deal for the American public, basically. Think about if you're playing cards and you have a really bad hand and, you lose that hand, and you're hoping that in the next deal you'll have some really good cards, a really good hand. And that's basically what FDR was promising to the American people, that he would give them a new deal, a new hand, something better than they had before. And so this New Deal program, it really completely changed the way the government handles the economy. It was more government intervention than had ever taken place before. And it really was kind of based on this premise that the government has the responsibility for people's well-being, to take care of the people. Very different than Hoover's idea of rugged individualism. So he believed the government needed to get involved. They needed to stimulate the economy. They needed to provide jobs for people. And so what he did was work with Congress and propose a great deal of legislation that would allow this to happen. So the main goals of the New Deal are the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And we're going to be looking at examples of all of those. He also wanted people to earn their keep. He wanted people to earn their keep, so government agencies were created to provide employment for people. He felt it was, he didn't just want to give a handout to people, he wanted to give them the opportunity to work, to earn their own money, and so several programs were created that would allow them to happen. Obviously, the government is the one funding these programs, of course, and that's a really new approach to the government in American history, or to the economy, I should say. So some of the first actions that FDR pushes for, and some of the first legislation, will include the Emergency Banking Act. And so what happened was that it allowed for banks to be shut down and inspected. These were known as banking holidays. So the banks were closed on those particular days, and they were allowed to reopen when they were considered healthy. And this was to restore people's confidence in banks, because they certainly had lost a lot when they lost all of their life savings because the banks had failed. So, after these bank holidays, after this, people started to redeposit money, and those banks would then have reserves and money on hand to invest in the economy. So that was a step in the right direction for banks. The Securities Exchange Commission was also created, and this still exists today, and that was to regulate abuses by the New York Stock Exchange, as well as practices like buying on margin, which we've talked about as that way to purchase stocks with only 10% of the money down. Another thing was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. This and the SEC both still exist today, and if you go into a bank, you might see a sign that says your deposits are FDIC insured. So that insured bank accounts in approved banks, That meant if the bank failed, the government had insured that money and you wouldn't lose all of your savings. Also, to put more money in circulation, FDR went off the gold standard. And if you recall, we've talked about this, that old populist idea, that old idea of William Jennings Bryan. We finally went off that gold standard. That put more money in circulation. Wages and prices increased. It gave the government more spending power. So all of these things were particularly things targeted toward the economy to help the nation recover. FDR also quickly made some groundbreaking appointments. And when we use the word groundbreaking, we mean something really big, really important, really something that hadn't been done before. And that was, in this case, we're talking about appointing women to really important positions. So the first would be Frances Perkins, who you see pictured here. She's the first woman cabinet member, so that's a huge deal. She was named as Secretary of Labor, and one of her main goals was to end discrimination in the workplace. Discrimination particularly with African Americans and other minority groups, to allow them to get back to work. Another woman was Mary McLeod Bethune. She was head of the Office of Minority Affairs. She advocated for employment of African Americans, and she helped organize a black cabinet to advise FDR on racial issues. So that's an important African American woman in FDR's cabinet, which is groundbreaking. It's something that had never been done before, and FDR is the first to really appoint women to these positions. So it's a big deal. Within a little over a decade after the 19th Amendment is passed, women are serving in these important government roles. So we can't talk about FDR's presidency without talking about his wife, Eleanor. Very, very famous first lady, probably one of the most active first ladies in American history. And she's also known as FDR's eyes and ears, and because in case you don't know, FDR had polio, and that left him disabled, and he was in a wheelchair. So he couldn't really get out there and walk amongst the people, but Eleanor could. And so Eleanor was the person out there listening to people's stories, shaking people's hands, hugging people, out there really with the people, sympathizing with them. And she was a real humanitarian, and she helped women, minorities, workers who were striking, trying to get better wages, things like that. She also was involved with the Declaration of Human Rights that was written and drafted by the United Nations after World War II. So she was really very, very active. She also was a member of a group called Daughters of the American Revolution, or the DAR. And if you've never heard of this group, to be a member of this group, you have to be a woman who is the descendant of an ancestor who served in the Revolutionary War. So anyway, this organization owned a hall in Washington, D.C., where an African-American singer, Marian Anderson, was supposed to perform in 1939. But they refused to allow her because they did not allow any of the African-Americans in this music hall, basically. And when Roosevelt found out about it, Eleanor Roosevelt, she arranged for Marian Anderson to perform at probably a better place, the Lincoln Memorial. So you can see Marian Anderson, she's pictured there on the bottom, and you can see the statue of Abraham Lincoln behind her. And so it was a very kind of poignant, very symbolic place for her to perform because she was segregated, just like every African American, from certain places, and she got the chance to play at the Lincoln Memorial, the ultimate symbol kind of the slave's freedom, and of the aspirations of African Americans in this country. So that was a really big deal. And Eleanor Roosevelt, never really forgave the Daughters of the American Revolution, so she resigned her position from that organization in protest, essentially, of the discrimination against Marian Anderson. So we can definitely see that Eleanor Roosevelt was a woman kind of ahead of her time as far as her involvement in civil rights. Another important event, another example of geography affecting history during the time of the Great Depression was the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl, the worst of it was from about 1934 to 1937. There was significant drought in the area of the country that you can see on the map there. and a lot of over-farming that took place on the Great Plains. And because of this over-farming, it was really stripping away the topsoil. It created a condition where the grasses weren't taking root, and then when the drought happened, there was just no moisture, and so the top part of the soil, the topsoil, basically blew away, essentially, in these huge dust storms that happened. If you can see the map on the top right there, where it shows areas damaged by the dust storms. It shows the Dust Bowl states, and then it shows the most severe area you can see there in the reddish-orangish color there. It hit the southern Great Plains the hardest, and about 60% of the population there would end up fleeing. And if you look at the map on the bottom, you can see some arrows that show the direction that the majority of these people were fleeing into, which was toward the west, particularly California. A lot of these people are referred to as Okies because, if you can see, the panhandle of Oklahoma was one of the hardest hit areas. The Okies, their plight was described in the book The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which is a very famous book detailing, the type of lifestyle that people were living as they escaped the terrible conditions of the Dust Bowl. So I'm going to talk about the photographs you see here, which are from the Dust Bowl. The one on the left that you can see actually shows the dust storm, the black blizzard, as they called it, that the winds kicked up, that stirred up all that topsoil. So like we experienced blizzards here in Buffalo, and we're certainly accustomed to it after this past winter, what they had in the air instead was just thick clouds of black dirt. Just imagine that, Snow was one thing because it melts, but this dirt and this dust, it did not. It just settled and buried. And if you look to the photograph on the right there, you can see how thick and how heavy that dust was when it settled. It even buried a car up until that point. So it was just very destructive. There was no way around it. It would seep through windows. It would seep under doors. It would come into homes. It was just a terrible menace, but it was also a huge health problem, too. People breathed this in. People had asthma, people caught pneumonia, people actually died from breathing this in. So it was, destructive, but it was also physically very harmful too, and you can see why people would want to escape it. But obviously in these conditions, nothing could be grown here, and so people who made their livelihood from farming had to leave to find some other type of income. And of course, in the book The Grapes of Wrath, which I mentioned before, what those people went to do in California was to basically pick grapes, to pick the farm crops there, where the ground was still fertile. In California, of course, has been one of the most fertile areas for growing crops. Right now, there seems to be a drought impending, and so you may see California definitely losing its place as far as how fertile it is and how much agriculture takes place there. But that was certainly some place that was an area that people escaping from the Dust Bowl went to escape that.